Some say the world will end in fire, wrote Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, wrote Robert Frost. Some say in ice. And while it wasn't the end of the world, for literally tens of thousands of residents of the Ottawa-Carleton region, it was a temporary end of the world they once knew. A world of warm, well-lit homes, running water, and other comforts so easily taken for granted. In the region's history, no state of emergency had ever been declared.
Our last check with Ottawa Hydro, about 20,000 homes were still in the dark. They don't expect that many of those will be up before tomorrow, unfortunately. And the
RMOC, the organization in charge of the region's care, had an emergency plan, but it had never before been forced into effect. On January 8th, with the worst ice storm in the region's history showing no signs of letting up, and temperatures scheduled to dip well below freezing, the question begged to be asked. Would the RMOC's emergency measures plan hold up?
As power continues to be restored in eastern Ontario, the news is not so hopeful.
Meanwhile, more than 900 hydro employees are still putting in long days on an electrical system that in some places needs to be entirely rebuilt.
It's heartwarming. My heart goes out to all the people who still don't have power because we have got a cold night ahead tonight and a cold day.
The emergency situation that we dealt with really started was a winter storm event, and we get lots of winter storm events here in Ottawa-Carleton. So it was really a connection we had with our road maintenance division. They have a road weather information system, so they're the ones that first alerted us to the fact that, this is a bit more than a regular winter snowstorm or ice storm that we deal with all the time.
That day, I guess on the 6th, late in the evening, we'd get calls from hydro utilities with large power outages, and we're getting calls from our roads people about roads being in very, very bad shape. We had to close down the Queensway that night.
So by Sunday, it's not so bad. We deal with it. Monday, well, it's a pretty bad situation, but we've had it before. Tuesday, well, geez, now we have a serious problem.
We decided to come to work, and I met one of my staff at 5 o'clock in the morning at the door, and then we started calling people in, people that would make a decision about whether or not to declare an emergency.
As the aftermath of 3 days of unrelenting ice and cold became apparent, the RMOC's hand would be dramatically forced. Still, as no state of emergency had ever been declared, the decision was a difficult one.
Hydro right now, there's still no word on those most recent power outages at Riverside and Upland, South Keys, also Carling and Acres. Transformers seem to have blown at those locations.
The chaos has led to massive shutdowns. Sections of the 417 highway linking Ottawa to Montreal have been closed. All schools are shut down for the rest of the week. So the head of Ottawa-Carleton finally cried uncle by declaring a state of emergency.
The decision was reached because of the unprecedented power outages and the risks associated with falling trees.
Once that decision was made, then obviously the next hours and days and not weeks would be dominated by media relations, public notification.
The declaration of an emergency situation does two things. It puts into, in a legal sense, into a plan of emergency operation, authorizes certain actions that would otherwise need council approval and special meetings and those sorts of things, principally to the expenditure of funds to ensure public safety and security. But the second thing I think it does, which is equally important, is communicate to the public that there's a serious situation out there and that we need to respond in an abnormal way.
That way necessitated the use of the region's emergency plan, calling for the assembly of a team of key officials and agencies and outlining their respective responsibilities in the case of an emergency.
The emergency measures plan includes members from all agencies, police, fire, ambulance, social services, OC, Transpo, amongst others. They are called on the calling of an emergency into the emergency measures room. They each have a desk, they have a radio and a telephone, and everything is coordinated through that particular location.
I think from a police perspective, it was important that we reacted quickly. It was important that the chief attended the media, the 2 daily media briefings with all the other agencies within the regional municipality, because that gave credence to our role, and I think it assured the residents of Ottawa Carleton that the police were available, were there to serve, and more importantly, there to protect them.
Current temperature has plummeted now to -5, and you factor in these gusty winds, which are causing near whiteout conditions apparently on some of the area roads. We're looking at a wind chill close to -20 degrees right now, and it will get worse as the temperatures
With the storm on the eve of its 4th day, its devastating impact in eastern Ontario became drastically clear. Agencies not specifically included in the plan had to be called upon. Chief among these was the Canadian Armed Forces.
I just arrived home in Petawawa, and my son kept running out and saying, "Are you going to Ottawa, Dad? It's on TV." And I kept saying, "No, we're not." And 2 hours later, I was heading to Ottawa. So the 8th of January, we received our first warning that the disaster was fairly widespread, significant, and Ontario was requesting assistance from the Canadian Forces. The greatest challenge was getting the brigade here. We wanted to move some 700 vehicles and 2,000 plus soldiers from Petawawa here as quickly as possible, but we didn't want a tragedy en route. The road from Renfrew into Ottawa was essentially a skating rink, and what was normally an hour-and-a-half or a 2-hour trip became 6 hours. By the end of that first 18 hours, we did have 2,000 soldiers in and around the area.
The military's assistance from day one when they arrived here was with tree cutting, pumping basements, helping rescue people out of homes. All you have to do is take a look at some of the newspapers and you'll see that. They're helping overall in one big picture here. They're a big team player too, as everyone else has been.
With the added strength of the armed forces and other essential agencies including Health Canada, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army, all of the players were now at the table. But despite the strength of the team, the plan they were on the verge of implementing had never before been put into effect. It was to be trial by fire, or as Robert Frost might have more accurately put it, trial by ice. Under the region's emergency plan, the first priority was to get an accurate assessment of the extent of the damage. As information poured in, each representative would notify his or her respective emergency service group, be responsible for the group's mobilization, and ensure that any actions necessitated by the emergency were promptly taken. Critical to the success of the plan was a continuous feedback loop to the community. That would assure the team that they would receive the most updated information in the shortest time possible. In 1990, in an effort to respond more efficiently to the demands of the community, the region had established a 24-hour information service line. That number, 560-1335, proved indispensable in keeping the team in touch with the people who needed them most.
It's recyclable. Yes.
Making this successful was a lot like making a movie. I saw myself really as a producer. I had an idea. I had to sell it to the management committee, but I needed somebody who could pull it all together. Pauline Meringer, who is quite well known within the organization, pulled the whole thing together, and then of course the actors, the people who were speaking. They had to provide the input. The chemistry that happened between Pauline and the staff was really the important factor in making this work.
560-1335 not only helped to paint the most accurate picture of the ice storm's many effects, it became a lifeline for those in need.
Pendant la période la plus occupée de la crise, le service 24 heures a reçu entre 8 à 10 000 appels par jour. Ça nous apparaissait comme la période la plus critique que les gens voulaient parler à quelqu'un.
I know the trucks are out all over the region trying to get those branches.
The next step was to assure that this same up-to-date information, from closed roads to fallen power lines, was consistently relayed to as large a number of residents as possible. This intense, ongoing task was the domain of the Information and Public Affairs Office.
L'équipe des gens qui travaillaient en communication pouvait changer ou varier entre environ 12 personnes à une vingtaine de personnes, incluant les gens qui nous appuyaient dans nos tâches plutôt quotidiennes, s'il y avait du quotidien finalement parmi la crise. Et puis on était appelés à faire toute une gamme de choses, émettre des communiqués de presse dans les 2 langues officielles, identifier des porte-paroles, faire un peu un triage finalement de toutes les demandes des médias qui rentraient à nos bureaux, et puis également être sur appel 24 heures sur 24.
An important area of concern were the arterial roads. Without their accessibility, hydro and other repair services would not be able to get to the region's countless residential areas to assess and address individual problems.
The arterial road system is really the lifeline of the region. All the emergency vehicles and service vehicles cannot get to where they're going unless those roadways are open. And that's always our primary goal, is to make sure that those roadways are maintained. Basically, our staff have been running pretty much continuously since last Sunday, and that's about a week now. And during that time, a lot of our staff who live in the rural areas have been without power and have been still out there running the roads and keeping things clear.
With the arterial roads clear, the area's hydro utilities could more easily conduct their damage assessment and repairs. Ontario Hydro had been trying to assess the damage for a week, but ice and bitter cold had made it difficult.
It took us several days to assess the scope of the damage, and it wasn't until Saturday after the storm started that we really were able to get out and find 5,000 plus broken poles, miles and miles of lines down, over 120 damaged tower structures on transmission lines. It really took us until the Saturday to figure out what we had on our hands, and then to try and mobilize the people to get the work done.
Yeah, we've got a new pole going in here. You can see that they've got it in now, but they're trying to put the anchors down into the swamp here. Once those are in, we can guide the pole back and start putting our wires up and dead end them. And then we can run the circuits off to the east and west here. And we've been going steady, 16, 18-hour days.
About 40% of all of our distribution facilities were damaged in some way. And that really is an immense amount of damage. It took decades to build the system to where it sits today. But in the end, we had over 5,000 broken poles. We had many miles of distribution line on the ground. And these things take a long time to put together. In terms of damage, every country road, every main supply line, every station was damaged in some way. When you run into something that's without precedent, you're by definition unprepared. And we were prepared, but we simply did not expect nor have witnessed a storm of this magnitude. We've reached an agreement with municipal utilities inside Ottawa-Carleton that they will, when their forces are ready to be released in their own jurisdiction, that they will work hand in hand and coincident with our people to establish power inside the regional municipality.
While the RMOC worked to bring back light and heat, residents were doing whatever they could to stay warm, some to their own detriment.
As the situation progressed, as the emergency went on, the type of calls we were getting changed. We started out with massive numbers of wires down, gas leaks caused by tree branches hitting gas mains, fires, electrified fences around schools because of wires, and then fires, more and more fires. And then it ranged, as people started to try and keep warm and use their imagination in very scary ways, we started getting the carbon monoxide calls, all kinds of carbon monoxide calls. We started getting people just doing crazy things to try and keep warm.
As part of its commitment to help restore power, the RMOC was faced with having to deal with the devastation to its trees. The weight of the accumulating ice had brought down more branches than in the city's heyday as a lumber town. Crews were immediately dispatched to deal with the many fallen trees and loose limbs that threatened both power lines and pedestrians.
The region has now asked that people bring their brush from their backyards and from their side yards, their front yards, out to the curbside. What we hope to do is to get those branches picked up in lieu of our regular waste pickup.
While power lines were being restored and electricity was slowly but surely returning to hundreds of area residents, other essential services, like water, had to be maintained as well. Fortunately, this was a situation the region was well prepared for.
We were quite fortunate here, unlike in Montreal, in that we do have standby generators. Our plant, in fact, was kept operating at all times, even when there was a power outage. We had upwards of 17 pumping stations, in fact, did have a power outage, but we always had standby generation. So the 700-odd thousand people on the central system, in fact, did have potable water at all times. This then allowed us to concentrate on supplying the rural areas without water. So we sped up a special unit that, in fact, delivered water either to the fire stations or ever required, both inside and outside our region.
Generators had become a valuable commodity. Fortunately, as the need for power increased, there was an array of willing suppliers, including OC Transpo.
Being the kind of operation we are, as I mentioned, we have a fleet of 800 buses, we have a large plant. Obviously, we have generators, and what we were able to do was to identify as many as we could to free up, to give to those at the region who were organizing the acquisition of generators and the deployment of generators. We were able to provide up to 6 generators. Some of them are very large, they were truck mounted, and they were sent off, again, throughout the rural areas to assist people and their homes and their businesses.
In spite of the RMOC's all-out effort, operations of this magnitude take time. While residents waited for their lives to return to normal, they benefited from the care of the RMOC's Social Services Department.
When the goods are going to...
We, as the Social Services Department, began our intervention in the disaster by contacting all the local municipalities to see what needs, requirements they might have from the support that the department could provide to them. The primary responsibility of the department in disasters is to be responsible for accommodations, for food, clothing, and we anticipated at some point that we might have to set up an emergency evacuation center. Little did we know that, in point of fact, we would be supporting anywhere from 20 to 30 or 40 different emergency centers where people came for food, clothing, and sleeping at night over a period of about 2 weeks. Very interesting at one point that there were a number of seniors across the region who required accommodation, and together we were responsible for a unit that was opened up at the General Hospital.
As the state of emergency continued, issues escalated from loss of power to potential loss of life. It became important to remind area residents of how to take care of themselves in this kind of situation.
Historically, public health disasters have been pretty well focused on one small neighborhood with one rather confined problem. The first message we sent out was about injury, and I think our immediate response was stay inside unless you absolutely have to, because clearly it was dangerous out there, the roads, the sidewalks, with the trees and the branches crashing down, and the state of the roads, the amount of ice on them, it was very precarious. So stay inside. And then that message, in fact, changed later on because people went out to sort of clean up some 3 to 7 days later. And then we had to tell them to be careful because the situation was again dangerous. With respect to the weather and no electricity and no heat, obviously our major message was directed at the issue of hypothermia, that people could get very, very ill and, in fact, freeze to death from cold exposure to cold. And the flip side of that message was that you had to be very careful in terms of how you dealt with this problem, because we did have a number of carbon monoxide poisonings, a number of smoke inhalations, and a number of burns, sadly enough, as people did what they could to keep their houses warm. Food safety was another concern because people, due to the absence of electricity, their refrigerators and their freezers weren't functioning. So we put out a message to that effect, and our message was quite simple. It was, when in doubt, throw it out.
Thanks to the activism and sound advice of the RMOC, the precarious situation presented by the ice storm was now well under control. But word had reached the RMOC of the terrible plight of those in eastern Ontario, outside the region. Ottawa-Carleton was in good hands. Those helping hands were now being offered to its neighbors. Eastern Ontario, outside Ottawa-Carleton, is largely rural, its geographic isolation exaggerated by the ravages of the storm. Not only were they out of reach of the control group's helping hand, some were even out of reach of the relief efforts set up in their own communities. The situation was drastic.
It was more difficult doing it with the outlying municipalities. Emergency Measures Office Ontario were running the operation from Toronto, but the face-to-face coordination of all the outlying municipalities was very difficult to do it in that manner, we found, and therefore we decided that the only way to achieve what we were going to do was establish the 5 emergency operation centers, which eventually did get set up.
In an effort to construct a more direct line of communication with Eastern Ontario communities, Emergency Measures Ontario, with the aid of the military and the support of the region, established 5 coordinating centers. This presented a more accurate picture of the immediate needs of those communities and permitted a more targeted response. Once the 5 centers had been established, the RMOC and its partners sent out its charges.
In this undertaking, we were involved with, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Agriculture. We also worked with Emergency Measures Ontario. We worked with Red Cross, who paid for a lot of the food that we had to purchase, food and materials we had to purchase. They had funds for that. We worked with Ministry of Transport, who were providing facilities for the storage of items coming into the Ottawa area. The military were of great help. They not only provided a location where we could unload trucks and then divide it up for the shipping to the 5 emergency operation centers, but they also provided a number of trucks and personnel for the actual movement of the materials.
But the difficulty was in providing relief without duplicating the efforts that the communities already had in place. A perfect example of how most rural communities reacted was Castleman, where the citizens had bonded together to provide full-time emergency response.
Tout le monde aide tout le monde. Il y a des gens qui rentrent chez vous, que tu ne connais pas, ils s'en viennent installer ta génératrice parce que là, tu as besoin de quelqu'un qui sait qu'est-ce qu'il fait parce que toi, tu le sais pas. Alors oui, puis je pense que dans les villes aussi, il y a eu quand même beaucoup d'entraide.
Working in collaboration, the RMOC was able to integrate its resources with what was already in place, thanks again to the presence of the forces.
Ottawa Carleton was, in a sense, well prepared for this. They had an emergency operations center established, which is manned from what I understand 24/7, and they're ready to crank it up on a moment's notice when an emergency occurs.
Essentially, it comes down to the same thing. People need assistance, and it gets down to very basic things. They want a psychological comfort that somebody is there to help them, and I think that our soldiers in their uniforms were very visible indication that people weren't alone.
Good evening, I'm Peter Van Dusen, and this is a special edition of Newsday. The state of emergency in Ottawa Carleton has been lifted now for urban residents.
The ice storm of 1998 left an unforgettable testament in its wake, not the least of which is the effectiveness of the RMOC's Emergency Measures Plan, the plan that helped to restore, relieve, and rehabilitate.
L'union fait la force, comme on dit, et puis je pense que les employés maintenant ils ont eu l'occasion de travailler ensemble et puis maintenant, ça aide à travailler en équipe quand on connaît quelqu'un, quand on a survécu quelque chose de difficile comme ça.
You can't look at your own boundaries. You have to, we cooperated quite a bit with the regional police and they assisted us with people, and you have to forget about your policing boundaries and I think even for the rest of the people, Hydro, Army, you have to forget about all your boundaries and just work together and look at the whole picture.
The region's work is far from over. After the cleanup, the plan calls for a post-emergency review.
A post-emergency review is important to document the events during the emergency, what actions were taken as a result of these events, and most importantly, to learn from the emergency.
One of the principal lessons to be learned after surviving this event is that you must have a plan.
I swear to God, those drugs weren't mine.
We were out having dinner, celebrating. Lisa had just been accepted to Emerson.
And what happened?